Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the HR Dialogues. I'm your host, Dr. Dieter Veldsman, and today we'll be discussing a topic that I'm very, very passionate about, and that's the topic of career management, and even more importantly, how we can drive data-driven careers going forward. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. I'm joined by Abhijit Navekar, the CEO of Careers Unleashed. Abhi, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Dieter.
It's really great to have you with us. Abhi, quick introduction to the guests listening today. Who's Abhi? What are you doing at Careers Unleashed, and what problem are you solving?
Perfect, Dieter. Thank you again. So I go by Abhijit Narvekar, as Dieter said, but everybody calls me Abhi. And my background comes from industrial engineering. And the whole idea there is how to improve a process. So I did that for Schlumberger, Halliburton in the oil and gas industry, but then I also wanted to change the processes for recruiting. So I started my first company in 2010, and then the second company is Career Unleashed. And the whole idea for Career Unleashed was using data analytics to really help people with their careers, as well as organizations to get prepared for future of work.
I love that, Abhi. I think we all get that question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I think more importantly, in today's environment, what does that next step look like? And I think careers have really changed in the last couple of years. We're talking a lot more about flexibility. We're talking a lot more about cross-functional careers. We're talking about skills-based organizations. So I think to kickstart us, help us understand what is the current status quo in terms of career management?
The way I think about it is we all, whether it's an organization or an individual, career management is done in a very reactive way. So we all wait for something to happen and then think about our careers. Nobody is doing it very proactively. They don't think about how I need to change or where will I be in the next 5 years. So we all need to be a little bit more proactive in our career. Even organizations, I feel the same thing. We all are driven by revenue, by profits. Yeah. So we all look at that and keep working towards it. But nobody's taking a step back to see, is everybody that we have hired as per our culture, is it really working very well? And what do we need to change so that the career management works out for everybody, retention becomes higher? We can also think about succession planning, because succession planning, again, we don't do it very well till somebody has left and then we panic. So I think the status quo is very reactive versus being proactive.
Something I've noticed, Abhi, is the fact that, you refer to it as reactivity. I sometimes think that people are so overwhelmed that careers almost tend to happen to them and not necessarily given the insight to say, this is how I'm going to construct my career and how I'm going to adapt in terms of what that would look like going forward. And I've always believed that career management is a little bit like the forgotten little brother in the talent management suite. We talk about talent at an organizational level, but sometimes we forget it's real people with real careers and with real journeys that we need to cater for. What have you found with regards to insights that can help people in terms of managing careers? And then we'll get to the great solution that you're putting forward at Career Unleashed.
Absolutely. So if we look at where we are going in terms of just as companies, the pandemic has changed the world entirely. And even before the pandemic, things were changing, but the pandemic accelerated it. And what I mean by that is, for example, gig economy. It has been there for a while. It has been maturing, but now we see that more and more people want to do smaller gigs so that they can spend more time with family, right? Same thing with AI and automation. Lots of tools are coming into play where we can automate some of the processes, thus giving us back more time. But all of these changes, as you correctly said, can be very overwhelming because you have been hired by a company to really perform a task. And you are really giving your best 100% so that you can look good towards the managers or towards with your team. So there's no time left in my mind to really think about how can I use these other tools to make myself better, or how can I use it to make my process better? So in a way, somebody needs to really watch over and coach them, saying that, okay, let's stop a little. Maybe have a day in a week to really think about outside the box. How can we do our job better? Who plays that role of a coach is a very interesting question. Is it HR? Is it a coach hired from outside? Or is it somebody in the team? Managers as a coach, I think, is also a stretch. Let me explain what I mean by that. Today's managers also are completely overwhelmed because they have to also meet the numbers. But now we are talking about mental health. So they are also worrying about how can I help my team so that they have a proper good work-life balance. That's, I think, putting too much on the managers, because of which they are overworked, overburdened, and they also now want to take a break. They're like, I'm done with this. I just want to take a break, and maybe I'll do it again later. So I think there's so many changes that is happening today that we really have to slow down a little and think of people as people.
Abhi, there's something interesting for me that you've mentioned where, I think in the career space, very often it was the manager playing this gatekeeper role. They were almost this portal to access to opportunities within the organization. And something I've noticed is really a shift towards how do we enable individuals through technology to spot other opportunities that sit within the organization. I'm not talking about, the internal job portal. I'm talking a lot more around things like talent marketplaces, gig opportunities. And I think the whole concept of real internal mobility is going to be such a game changer in the career space going forward. But there's a very big caveat to that. And I think the first thing there is we need to reshape and redefine what we mean by a career, because I think a lot of people still have a very traditional sense of a linear path, typically driven by either seniority or status and increase in remuneration. What do you think is different in terms of how we should be defining careers today?
Absolutely. Now, this is the exact reason why we, in fact, started thinking about Career Unleashed. And let me explain a little bit on that. So when we were doing recruiting for a lot of different companies, when I started my recruiting company, we also coached a lot of people. And through that process, what I realized was that, so I'll give an example. In your world, I'm sure you know a lot of students who are graduating with liberal arts degrees. In liberal arts, there is not a very clearly defined career path, meaning if somebody did Bachelor of Arts in English or history or psychology, the career management or career tools are vast and open. You could do anything you really want, but then where do I start? So a lot of people were confused on the student side, right? And what happens there is you got coaches that universities provide you, but there's one coach for 1,000 kids, not sustainable. And then Google or all the static information is overwhelming because they'll throw everything at you, right? So that was one problem. Now let's look organization. You defined it very well. What we saw was HR departments and lots of companies have linear career paths. So meaning you have done A, the next step is B, C, D. Yeah. What happens if the next step involves a lot of travel? But I cannot travel right now. My family constraints don't let me travel. So is there any other role in the organization that I could take and not get stuck without getting a promotion? So this is a question a lot of people struggle with. And when you ask an organization saying, are there any other things I could do? They are at a loss too, because they have not done the analysis, especially for larger organizations. They are global. There are lots of different things happening. But how do you know what's happening where? Where are these roles really open? And it's, as you correctly said, it's not about, opening a job and letting all the employees look at a job and let them apply. Again, this is a reactive way of doing it. You are just like pushing the problem onto somebody else. But today's world, what we see that has worked is active networking even internally. That's one, meaning you have to create programs where employees share their best practices with lots of different kind of teams and organizations globally. Through that interaction, they are making themselves visible. They are sharing their knowledge, their skills with others. And that's how we start building a camaraderie where the organization is going to be lifted up, right? Then let's think about, you mentioned talent mobility in terms of, even education. Lots of departments, they say when we are recruiting, saying, okay, this person looks very good, Abhi, but they don't have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. Well, the person is having great skills in what you really want them to do. Why are we worrying about education right now? Well, the answer is correct. They say that, The way we do promotions, the great changes in our organization is based on one aspect, KPI, is degree. Well, that means we need to now start thinking about changing that world as well, saying that if somebody doesn't have a degree, doesn't mean they get stuck. Well, then we'll have to change our policies to get there.
There's a couple of things, Abhi, that stands out for me. And let me comment on the last piece first. I think there is a very big movement at the moment around what are the real predictors of success within a job, within a task, within an activity. And I think what I've been very encouraged to see in the work environment is that we are almost going to test the traditional criteria of, does this really indicate whether this individual will be successful or not? I've said this before on the show, but I had a chief marketing officer that once made the comment to me that said, don't tell me you're funny, tell me a joke, which basically refers to the fact, show me what you can do, and then we'll have the conversation around how best we can apply that. So first point from my side, I think the whole skills-based movement is a positive one if we are able to really understand what are those key criteria that will predict performance. I think criteria like degrees, etc., they've got their place in certain aspects, but I don't think they can be the sole end all and be all. We are narrowing down our talent pools in an unnecessary way, and I think we are depriving people of the opportunities that they might have as part of that movement. Second point that really stood out that you mentioned is work-life fit. I think the conversation at the moment around it's a real human being, whereas a career fits into the context of where they find themselves in their lives. If you think about career and life stages, very often these things overlap when I start moving into managerial and leadership positions, when some people are starting families, when I'm trying to settle down and put down a root somewhere else. Even though that's a very traditional view of the world, it does have significant implications for what is your appetite at the moment for those traveling a lot opportunities, or for the longer hours, or for doing the additional coursework that I need to that's going to be after hours. Maybe that's not possible where I find myself. And the third point that you've mentioned that I think is so important to understand is visibility. I sometimes find even within organizations, leadership tends to be so hesitant to make it visible around the great skill sets that sit in different parts of the organization. The old problem of talent hoarding, where I literally hold on to the talent I have because I've developed them, I've invested in them, and then eventually they leave because they don't see an opportunity for themselves in terms of moving elsewhere. So for me, the whole career management movement is tied into skills on the one side, but also really tied into rethinking where talent belongs in the organization and how we can create those meaningful career experiences for people as part of that. So I'm going to throw that back to you on that note.
One model that has been tested and has worked for a lot of companies is rotation programs. And a lot of companies don't use this very well, meaning right from a person who comes in as a graduate, young professionals, is there a program in place where you rotate them for different functions of the organization? Because at that point, you are starting to evaluate skills in a practical way. As you correctly said, in interviews too, it's easy to say that I have done this, or it's also easy to say, I haven't done it, but I'll learn. Well, that's not enough. You have to prove to me that you have the capability of learning. Now, you can throw a challenge at me saying that, yes, Abhi, but today loyalty is not there. Meaning, earlier we would go in one company, and if they are treating us well, we would just stay with them for a while till something really happened. But today, that's not the case. The market, as you said, is changing very rapidly. Salaries are changing. Companies are throwing money so that you can attract the right talent. So people are very used to saying that I've been here for 2 years, but I'm getting a 50% increase in my salary. And they don't focus that much on the environment because they still have not felt the need to focus on mental health, depending on the stage of their life they are in. So they very quickly say that I'm going to go try it out there. If it doesn't work, I'll come back to you. So then, will the rotation program work? But then we have also seen rotation program creates visibility, creates pride, saying that, hey, I can really make an impact in this business because I've seen all the different aspects of the business and I understand what I'm doing, how it is connected to that end revenue, to the end goal. And I want to now stay with this company to make that happen, to see that I have made an impact to this organization. So that's the rotation program thought that came to my mind. Hope that made sense.
Abhi, you mentioned such a good point for me around the holistic talent experience. And I think the employer-employee relationship is changing quite a bit. You know, you spoke about loyalty. I think loyalty looks very different for different people as part of their career journeys. For some, it's, you know, building a career in one environment. For others, it's in one profession. What I do believe is lacking quite a bit when we talk about visibility is how do we help people understand what is possible? I speak to a lot of HR professionals, and where they often get stuck in terms of not only their own careers, but the careers of the individuals within the business, is people can only understand and see the possible in terms of what's happening in their immediate sphere of influence. So let me make it practical. I might want my manager's job, the linear movement. I've seen other people move up, or I've seen other people do lateral moves within the organization, or horizontal moves. All of a sudden, I think that is how careers work. Whereas I don't understand that outside of my own context, there's actually a lot more going for me in terms of additional opportunities, new career patterns, new paths, new skill sets that I can learn. So how can we use data to create that visibility? Because on the one side, I want visibility of the skill I have in the organization, but on the other side, I want to create hope of what is possible for employees to manage their own careers.
Very good question. And again, it brings me back to a little bit of how we are doing it in Career Unleashed as well. So hopefully both the aspects we can cover in terms of how we are doing it and how organizations can do it as well on their own. So the idea we had, the problem that we were solving with Career Unleashed was, as I mentioned earlier, linear career paths and students unable to identify what careers they should go for. The way we did it was, we had a lot of resumes because of our recruiting business. The idea was we have a lot of data. What if we gather all of this data and start performing some analytics on it? So for the student side, what we thought of doing was analyze all the resumes for a degree. For example, let's start with Bachelor of Arts in English and see what real people have done in their life. What was their first job when they graduated? Aggregated information saying that 50% of English graduates this first job, as an example. And then how did they grow their career? What happened to them in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? You could also start thinking about, are there people with English graduate who became CEOs? I just want to discover how they went about. Did people stick to the linear path? Or did they go all over the place, as now people say it, a squiggly career path, right? Going from one thing to the other, and then attaining the goal. If they did do a squiggly path, did they attain the goal faster, or it didn't matter? How does that hard skill compare with your behavior skill? So we started doing all of this for students, but then we realized, as you correctly said, in organizations. So we realized organizations can use data analytics in various ways. I'll give some examples. Lots of companies have internal data analytics team, or they have a chief data officer, and those folks might be using the data from a revenue, again, from a business standpoint. But if you start applying it to people, wonderful things can happen. Explanation. One, diversity and inclusion. We don't know what we don't know, meaning lots of companies say we go to top 50 universities to go get our graduate students, or these are the competitive companies that do similar products, and we go and hire from those companies. Well, if we open up our mind and start looking at where are people in general, forget the top 50 universities, forget the companies that you usually go to, can we find similar people outside of your ecosystem? And you use data to do that. Same thing, finding people with very difficult to fill roles. Use data. This is all, in my mind, called intelligence-based activity, whether it's intelligence-based recruiting, intelligence-based career planning, intelligence-based succession planning. Data really helps you make smart decisions. And also, if somebody pushes back, you can use the data to prove your point, saying this is what the industry trend is showing me. This is what my data is showing me. And we can work together to make sure the analysis and the data gathering process is correct, right? So in companies, we have seen that different companies have different challenges. So some companies, you know, when they think about career management, they don't know where to start, right? They don't have one place where data is very well organized. Data is all over the place. So first challenge is just to gather the data. Second challenge company has is they use very strong HR systems, but they are like big systems, like a ERP system, right? So it takes a long time for them to implement that, to absorb that data, and then to perform analytics. Well, is there a faster way to absorb the data and perform analytics? Data challenges are the same, whether it is people, whether it is a business challenge that you're solving. So we have to create taxonomies, we have to create internal maps to make sure everybody's talking the same language. But once these things are done correctly, then presentation of data becomes easier and making decisions based on the data becomes easier.
What I do think is quite important, Abhi, in what you've explained is I think we need to have a thorough understanding in the organization around what is the work to be done within the organization. So what are the opportunities that sit in the organization? How does that link towards certain skill sets? And I think something that we don't spend enough time on is, after we've defined the taxonomies and after we've defined all the definitions of skills, is helping individuals understand what are your own transferable skills and where can you go and apply them somewhere else. I think when we grow up, we get so caught up in this mindset around, it's almost tied to our identity. I ask you the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? You immediately have a role or a job or a profession in mind. Nobody mentions, when I grow up, I want to be able to do the following. And I think that's a limiting mindset for us around thinking broader than the traditional notion around the frameworks, that has guided careers very much up to now. Because I think it's starting to shift towards being a collection of experiences I collect over time that's driven by my own interests, my ambition, the opportunities I want to pursue, in alignment then with what the organization needs and what the organization can offer. And if we are able to give that intelligence both to the organization and to individuals, I think it's a game changer for how people think about their own mobility and how they kind of pursue that next step for them in their career.
I was smiling because I think you hit a nerve on some of the topics that you were talking about. So when I come from the oil and gas industry, and when we were doing recruiting in 2014, oil and gas industry took a nosedive. So a lot of people lost their jobs. And we have a society here called Society of Petroleum Engineers, and they had invited me to come and talk to some of the reservoir and petroleum engineers. And we noticed two things. One is, you're absolutely correct, your identity. And when people who have been with companies for 30 years, 35 years, all of a sudden lose their job, the identity becomes a big problem for them. They start thinking that I'm not valuable. They associate their personal self-worth to the title they had. See, not the skills. They think that I was a reservoir engineer, petroleum engineer. I did so many phenomenal things for company ABC. And now these jobs don't exist. So their mind doesn't think about what tasks did you do to perform that, whatever, reservoir engineering, petroleum engineering, and how can you apply those skills that you had in a different world? And to solve this problem, I'll give an example to you. So we just recently spoke to an individual who came from India to the United States, mid-career experienced professional. And they had a lot of experience in India in a complete different domain, performing HR and recruiting activities. They were not getting an opportunity in their mind. They kept telling me, he or she kept telling me, saying that, Abhi, I'm getting interviews, but they all say that I don't have enough experience in the US market. Or they say that, well, you have never done recruiting in the finance domain or in the healthcare domain. You come from engineering. And I'm at a loss. I have no idea what to do. And, depression, everything, all sorts of problems were happening. And to solve this, the way we coached him or her was that reminded them of how did you perform recruiting, as an example, in India? What were the things that you did? Please write that down. And then we said, you're interviewing for a healthcare company. So I want you to execute the steps that you did in India for engineering for finding a nurse. Just do it for me and show it to me. And they did it, and they were able to find great nurses. So what we told them was, use this strategy in the interview, saying, don't just say, I'll be able to do it. Here's an example. I actually did the search. using everything that I've learned for the past 15 years, and here are the results within that interview. He or she got the job, right? So again, they have the skills, somebody needs to coach them to define in their mind who they are or what they can do. The self-worth is not associated to a job, a career. It's who you are. You know to solve problems. How do you solve those problems? If you can articulate that and actually display that I can solve this for you as an example, then companies will want those kind of people.
I think there's a very important point. I mean, I want to sketch two very different scenarios. I think on the one side, what you've mentioned is really we tie our career journeys into ego and status and identity. And I think very often that gets us into trouble around not wanting to make particular moves. Now, I'm a pragmatist at heart, so I completely understand that there's real world considerations that you also need to think about when moving in your careers. However, on the other side, I think we still subscribe to a way of thinking, that I can't do that job. And I want to use a practical example here. I've seen that with people in late stage careers, not yet retiring, but they've kind of made the moves that they wanted to in their chosen career and profession. And then all of a sudden a new opportunity pops up, but it's not aligned to the identity that they've crafted, the story of 25, 30, 35 years. And I've seen so many individuals then struggling to say, but hang on, there's a new chapter that I need to move into and what that's going to, really going to look like. I think on the other side that you've also mentioned, we struggle to tell our own career story. We really struggle with that question. And, whenever I do interviewing coaching before people go into interviews, I still start with a question to say, tell me a little bit about you. What's been your journey up to now? And it fascinates me that people are really, really struggling to articulate what that story is. And to your earlier point, what I learned to do along this particular career journey. Not the roles I was in. It was what did I do in each of these scenarios and in each of these contexts. And I think until we get that right and help people to really transition into telling a sound, solid, evidence-based career story, I think it's going to be really difficult to help people see what is possible in new environments and across industries and, applying new skills to new challenges that will be popping up in the new world of work.
No, absolutely. And, so brand identity, branding yourself, I come from a product management background, and in product management, we talk about what is the need for this product, what business case or what problem are we solving with this product? What is the competition for this product? Right? We have to articulate that value proposition correctly, pricing correctly. You take these principles of product management and apply to yourself, right? You are the product right now. And how do you now talk about the value proposition you bring to the table? What problems are you solving? What is the worth from a salary standpoint? So branding of a particular individual, in their mind, they have not thought it through. So we have to help them. Now, let me talk a little bit on a different note here, which is comfort zone, right? So we all operate in our comfort zone because that's what we have done consistently over and over and over again. So that's why we become an expert at whatever skill we have. Now, the pros of this approach is you are very good at that particular aspect. And if there are many opportunities internal to your company or external, then you will get that next place in the career ladder, whatever it is, as we said, squiggly or linear. But what if the skill is very niche? And now you need to stretch yourself outside of that comfort zone. There are two topics to this. One is, I always think and believe that when you step outside of your comfort zone, I say miracles happen, meaning something new. You get a new life. You start learning new things, and then you really excel yourself forward to whatever that goal is. But I have to be careful here because there are time and place for everything, meaning depending again on the pressure you are in, whether it is personal pressure, professional pressures, financial pressure, if you start stretching yourself too thin or start going too much outside of your comfort zone, as we say, the rubber band, it'll break at some point. And we have to have that balance of understanding what can I do at this stage of my life. It's okay to say that, you know what, Abhi, I'm going to stay within my comfort zone because there's so many other things happening. I have no bandwidth to learn a new AI tool or try a new job. I just need to find something that can really keep me stable. And there's nothing wrong with that because then you're mentally stable and happy. But there are other times where you have that bandwidth of doing other things. At that time, you shouldn't stay in your comfort zone. You should push yourself, go out there, try some new things, acquire some new skills, and you will become even more successful.
And I think it also boils down, very strongly towards the type of culture and environment that you create in an organization for careers to be able to flourish, because it is co-ownership and it is co-accountability of careers. It's for the individual, perfectly aligned to what you said around saying, where am I currently? What is it that is important for me at this stage of my life? And what do I have bandwidth for? And then on the other side, the organization saying, what do we need now? And how do we create an environment where people can step into those opportunities that we do want to provide? So, Abhi, I want to bring us back to the HR domain. And we've spoken about quite a few things already around how do we enable careers in organizations going forward. We've spoken about the fact that you need data to understand what is possible. You need data to understand what do the skills look like. People need the insights to know how can I apply my skill sets elsewhere in order to move into new opportunities. We've touched on the fact that culture is going to be important and the changing definition of what a career looks like, and that it needs to fit into the life stage where people find themselves and their ambitions and their bandwidth. If I'm an HR professional, I come to you and I say, Abhi, I want to get started on rethinking how we do careers in our organization. Where do I start? What advice would you give me?
Very good. I think it's a great point. And I think we always start with where we are today, understanding. So discovering of what have we done so far and what data we have to then use it to make it better, if you may. So without kind of doing an audit of where we are, I think we will start working on things that are not really going to make that big of an impact to the organization. So as an HR organization, I would first look at what have we done? Where are our gaps? Meaning, do we have gaps in talent management, attracting talent from the outside? Do we have gaps in terms of retention? People are leaving our company and we need to understand why that is happening. Do we have a gap in diversity and inclusion? Meaning, so some companies might say we have been using skills, Abhi, but then we keep kind of finding the same kind of talent. So then you have to analyze that, saying that why are we attracting the same kind of people? Can't we hire a diverse group of people? So I think we always start with what have we done so far, what data we have. Then we define, saying from that point on, saying, let's choose the big impact challenge that will affect your revenue so that because HR groups, like anybody else, we have to justify, we have to create a business case so that we can use the budget at the right place at the right time. So if the big challenge is, as you said, retention, then we have to start thinking about why this retention is not. So training and learning, meaning, is it because people are not seeing enough internal mobility, upward opportunities, or they just don't know how to get there, meaning their performances are suffering? Are we exploring the performances correctly? So I think the approach we need to take is looking at what we have today, what is the KPI that will create the biggest impact. Then we define, saying, will data analytics help? If data analytics help, how are we going to gather that data? Depending on different company stages, 47% of HR leaders are focusing on employee experience because retention has become a problem for them. 44% said they don't have proper career paths defined in their organization. And then 46% of HR leaders said recruiting is a big challenge for them. All of this is almost 50% of HR priorities. So what I think it's a very important topic for all of us to think it through. There are various tools that are helping us to solve this particular problem. I think it always starts with an audit and discovery of where we are, what have we done, what kind of problems we have, gap analysis, and then how does that impact my organization, create a priority list. From that, choose the first priority, start with a small project. I always believe in don't wait for years to show the result. Try something small, right? It's minimum viable product mentality. throw something out there, get the buy-in from your stakeholders saying, okay, this made sense. Let's now invest more money into it. But what you showed, if it didn't make sense, you have to still spend time on that to figure it out without investing a whole year and then realizing that there was no impact that was created because of this project.
No, that's great. Thanks so much, Abhi. And I think it's nice practical steps for HR professionals. As we start moving towards the end of our conversation, Abhi, I want to ask you a question. With all the data analysis that you've done at Career Unleashed, what has been some surprising findings for you about careers and how things are playing out that you did not expect to see?
Oh, again, a great question. So, it's easy to look at career paths and say, what is the most common career path that people took, right? Everybody thinks about that, saying that, let me take the, what is the phrase, road taken, and then figure out because I'll be successful too. Well, if we challenge yourself saying that, what were the really small number of people who did something different? What was their, path not taken? And you'll start learning some very impressive things, like English majors doing something that you had never thought of doing. And that's when it becomes more interesting to analyze why he or she was successful doing this path. And it then comes down to behavior and skills. What were the combination of behavior and skills to really propel themselves into a complete different industry? Today we talk about new industry that is coming up, and it's not new industry, but sustainability has become a big thing for every industry. And, everybody is now thinking about it. The younger generation puts a lot of thought into how do we sustain, whether it is earth or any processes that we are working on. And if we think about the new jobs that will come from that, it's going to be tremendous. And if we analyze even that data, saying that let's think about sustainability and who are doing what today, and how does the future evolve? That gives you a little bit of a very interesting insight. Another thing that we saw was when we did diversity and inclusion analysis, you realize that certain universities, you get a lot more diverse candidates, and you don't see that data unless you really focus in on it. And if you don't have enough data, even then that's a problem. So you have to kind of do a wider analysis and then start thinking about, why is this geography or this university doing a lot better in terms of diversity? So there are insights that start coming through that you would have not thought about it in the beginning, but now it's making sense. The other one is, as I said, the auditing was very interesting to us, meaning lots of companies have their, big companies have their internal data analytics team do something. But then coming from the outside, does it match up? Why is it not matching up? Right? That gives you newer insights again in terms of internal mobility or external. We can even do internal mobility. Think about it, right? Just looking at resumes, you know how the person moved internally within the organization.
I'm a very big fan of doing the analysis internally from an internal mobility point of view, because I think it showcases to people again what is possible, what has been the paths that other people have explored, and sometimes in my experience they tend to be very unconventional and not what you expected in the least. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the HR Dialogues. And Abhi, I think a couple of key things that stood out for me. The first one is that the nature of careers are changing, and we need to change our own mindset about what a career looks like, how we need to navigate our own career, and what that next step is going to be. Secondly, we have to start thinking about data-driven career insights. At an organizational level, what are those opportunities available within the organization or within the profession? And at an individual level, what have others done before that I can learn just what is possible? With where I am now and the skill sets that I have, what is that next step going to look like for me? I love the fact that we spoke about transferable skills, helping people understand what it is that they have to work with, what it is that they need to learn, what it is that they need to develop. And I really appreciated the notion also around the fact that we have to start thinking broader than where we find ourselves at the moment. I think internal mobility, I think cross-organizational mobility is going to be very, very important. And lastly, the point on meaningful work. It doesn't matter if work doesn't matter to you in the longer term, and it has to fit into the work life that you are trying to build for yourself and for the broader organization as well. So Avi, on that note, thank you very much for joining us in the HR Dialogues. Appreciate the wisdom and appreciate the insights that you've shared.
Thank you again, Dieter, for this wonderful conversation. Hope it will be valuable to you and the audience.
Thank you very much, Abhi. And on that note, everyone, thank you very much for listening to the HR Dialogues. I'm your host, Dr. Dieter Veldsman. Until next time.